Why hello you lovely little peppercorns, my name's Noa Lee, god of game criticism and lord of excellent taste, and Penny's Big Breakaway is the debut game of indie developer Evening Star, a momentum-based 3D platformer reminiscent of Sonic Adventure with a slew of unique ideas that gives the game its own personality, but one that's unfortunately marred by a high level of frustration and a forceful design that shows a lack of trust with the artistic process. Let's set the stage. Back in 2017, a little game came out that you may have heard of called Sonic Mania. The game was notable for being a return to form for the blue blur, but also for the fact that many of its developers were longtime Sonic the Hedgehog fans who were well known within the Sonic community, including and especially the game's director, Christian Taxman Whitehead, who prior to that had made a name for himself porting updated versions of Sonic 1, 2, and CD to mobile platforms. After the release and massive success of Sonic Mania, Whitehead, along with many other developers who worked alongside him, formed Evening Star, and talks between this new studio and Sega began almost immediately for a potential Sonic Mania follow-up. However, these talks eventually fell through, and Sega decided to go with Sonic character creator Naoto Oshima's studio R Zest for this supposed follow-up, a project that would ultimately become last year's Sonic Superstars. This break with Sega caused Evening Star to fully devote themselves to their own project, which would eventually become today's subject, Penny's Big Breakaway. I think this history is very important not only to the story of this game, but to Evening Star as a company, because Sega deciding not to continue working with the developers that crafted the most successful and highly rated Sonic the Hedgehog game in decades was a bit of a shock to everyone, and I imagine it was one that hit Evening Star particularly hard, as by all accounts they were already gearing up to make said follow-up, to the point that they even began developing a new in-house 3D game engine as Sega decided that they wanted the Mania successor to be 2.5D instead of sprite-based. And while this is probably just a case of Sega preferring the pitch they got from Studio R Zest over the one they got from Evening Star, I imagine the Evening Star team had to sort of scramble to come up with their own project to fill the void left by the Sonic game that was never meant to be, and that desperate energy is unfortunately quite palpable in Penny's Big Breakaway. In this game, you of course play as Penny, a young performer looking to make a name for herself in a world that's all about entertainment, performance, and the theatrics of the stage. During a particularly fateful day when this land's star performer and ruler, Emperor Eddie, is holding auditions for a new act, Penny stumbles upon a mysterious object called a cosmic string, which brings her beloved Yo-Yo to life and gives her much greater control over her tricks and maneuvers. As such, she and Yo head to the stage to show the world what they've got. However, things don't quite go as planned, as Yo gets a little too crazy, to the point that the two of you end up embarrassing the Emperor and now find yourselves on the run from his army of penguin guards. Right off the bat, I can't help but admire the sheer amount of creative energy that went into not only the characters of Penny's Big Breakaway, but also the cutesy world and its performer/audience theme. This is a world that's all about showmanship and the art of the stage, and the game uses this central theme as a backdrop for almost everything it does. As you race through the levels riding Yo and dodging penguins, you can't help but drink in the world around you. Subtle accents such as light fixtures, slopes, and ramps, as well as certain platforms, all allude to this central theme, even if the set dressing itself happens to change from level to level, with this aspect going a long ways towards sucking you into this world and making you want to stop and spend some time in it. Which is good, because the gameplay certainly doesn't. Now, this is the part of the video where I know I'm already going to be splitting the audience, at least among those of you who have actually played Penny's Big Breakaway, because I know that reviews and opinions of this game have been a little mixed so far, and I also know that there's a small but passionate fan base for this game already, and I know you're all fighting pretty hard to convince the world that this game's amazing, and I certainly admire the passion. I just completely disagree. That said, know that what I'm about to say comes from a place of art criticism as well as a personal disappointment, not from a place of hate, because I really wanted to like this game, and actually at times I did really like this game, but I'm of the opinion that games should be critiqued and judged as a whole package. I don't pick and choose the good stuff and ignore the bad, and furthermore, I believe that every aspect of a game affects and reinforces every other aspect of the game. Its constituent parts don't matter individually. What's important is how it all fits together. So with that little disclaimer out of the way, let's dive in. As a momentum-based 3D platformer functioning in the vein of the Sonic Adventure games, Penny's Big Breakaway forgoes the typical hub or overworld layout of most games in the genre, opting instead for a progression that's entirely level-based, with you able to return to previous levels simply by selecting them from a menu. The game is made up of 11 different worlds, each broken up into anywhere from 2 to 6 different levels, with the occasional boss encounter thrown in. Each level has you racing from start to finish along a set path broken up with slopes, platforming segments, puzzle areas, and other little mini-games and obstacles for you to to overcome, with the ultimate goal being to make it to the end of the level and rack up some sick-ass bonus points on a miniature stage in a series of quicktime events. They're actually a lot more fun than they look. And this is probably the best part of Penny's Big Breakaway overall. Its level design is top-notch, and clearly a lot of thought and effort went into making each and every level not only interesting from a structural standpoint, but compelling from a gameplay perspective as well. Each level is ultimately linear, with only a single main route from start to finish, but there are a wide variety of alternate paths for you to take, which may or may not be easier, as well as allowing you to mix and match to try and get a faster time and a higher score if you care about that sort of thing. The puzzles, minigames, and platforming segments incorporated into each level that I mentioned earlier also seamlessly fit into this overall level design and are constructed in such a way that they don't usually slow you down all that much, with most levels, at least design-wise, fostering a steady pace and flow from start to finish. Clearly, level design was a top priority for Evening Star, and I applaud them for their efforts, as having level design that's not only reminiscent of the classic Sonic the Hedgehog games, but manages to surpass them in a lot of ways, and in 3D no less, is no easy feat, which is why it's so rarely been done before. Overall, Penny's Big Breakaway knocks it out of the park with its level design, and in a way that merely takes inspiration from Sonic Adventure, but still manages to have its own personality that goes beyond just being an homage. I really have no complaints with this aspect of the game. So if the problem isn't the level design, what is it? Well, a few things actually. The first of these is admittedly a minor one, but it managed to cause no shortage of frustration for me during the early moments of my playthrough, and that's the fact that for practically your entire journey, you're being chased by the aforementioned penguin guards that seek to capture you, and this, in my opinion, is just a straight up awful idea. As you're trying to race throughout each level, these guys will just pop out of the woodwork and try to dogpile Penny into submission. If 5 penguins manage to latch onto you, it's lights out and you go back to the last checkpoint. This, however, isn't really the problem, as I only ever got caught once by the penguins during my entire playthrough, mostly because they're really easy to shake off simply by swinging your yo-yo around. No, the real problem is that each time one of these guys latches onto you, which is very often, there's just this little bit of a hiccup in the game that's enough to throw off the rhythm of your momentum, or can screw up the trajectory while jumping and cause you to miss a platform, or slow you down just enough that you mess up a time trial or something like that. And this happens constantly from the moment you begin your journey to the moment the credits roll, and it is beyond annoying. I don't think you actually move any slower when there's a penguin latched onto you, but it feels as if you move slower when there's a penguin latched onto you, and in a game that's all about maintaining a sense of speed and momentum as you race toward your goal, that is far from ideal. The bigger problem than a solitary penguin latching onto you, however, is the fact that in a lot of instances there will simply be too many penguins to avoid running into them at all, and in these cases you have to stop and take your time to ward them off with your yo-yo, which isn't difficult, but it takes up a lot of time and causes you to have to practically just sit there staring at the screen until the penguins are thinned out enough for you to proceed. To be fair, moments like this only take up a few seconds of your time, but in a game that's so heavily based around going fast and racing the clock, these seconds of downtime become outright agonizing, to the point that were I the kind of person that was into doing time trials and the like, would probably just be enough for me to stop and reset the level rather than bothering to deal with the penguins and hope that I manage to squeak by them on my next attempt. To be even more fair, I did get used to the penguins as I played, and they became less of an issue, but at that point it's sort of a question of why even bother having them in the first place. If the player has to get used to something for it to get a pass, that doesn't necessarily make it good, it just means that you've worn them down to the point that they've merely accepted their fate. I can't help but wonder how much better this game would have been without the penguins, or if they were less frequent than they are now. Well, actually, I don't have to wonder, because one of the worlds you go to doesn't have them at all, and big surprise, it just so happens to feature the 2 best levels in the entire game. Weird. Ultimately, the penguins are just an annoyance that certainly don't ruin the game, but they're an annoyance that serves no purpose and should just be removed entirely, as they only detract from the overall experience. I get that the title of the game and its narrative both allude to Penny constantly being on the run, and that's why you're racing from start to finish, but you really don't need a mechanic like this in order to reinforce that theme. Just let the excellent level design naturally coax the player toward that end, as it so expertly does. Now, before anyone accuses me of nitpicking here with the penguins, know that this is just a minor issue at the end of the day. An annoying one, sure, but a minor one overall. The bigger issue, however, and what I would consider to be this game's biggest flaw, is actually Penny herself. Character-wise, I quite like her look and mannerisms overall. I know there have been some complaints about the character designs in this game, and Penny in particular, but personally, I quite like it. She's cute, charming, and has a striking look that makes her stand out from the crowd. Maybe people just don't like the colors blue and yellow together, but I don't know, I've always liked this combo. I mean, just look at me. I'm looking fly as fuck right now. The rest of the cast, though, is a little on the bland side in my opinion, but even worse is that a lot of these characters just look as though they're from different games all stitched together into a ROM hack or something, and none of them, save for Penny, really fit in with the rest of the world and its overall look. However, it's the way that Penny feels when moving about, as well as the overall control scheme of this game, that I take most issue with. The controls for this game, while not bad, are really odd and take more than a little getting used to. For starters, Penny's Big Breakaway actually has two different control schemes, Pro and Standard. Standard mode has your typical jump and attack buttons in their standard spots as face buttons on your controller, but Pro mode swaps them around so that you jump with the left shoulder button and attack using the right thumbstick, and while it's a neat idea, it's a lot more cumbersome than it should be, and for no real reason as far as I can tell. On the one hand, I like the idea behind this as it turns the game into a sort of twin-stick action game, with the idea being that you move with one stick and can independently aim and fire your yo-yo with the other, while moving your jump button and the ability to ride your yo-yo to the shoulder and trigger buttons respectively ensures that your thumbs never need to leave the sticks. This is a concept that's often referred to as game feel, and it's a difficult concept to nail down, but the general idea is that you want to have your controls and the player's hand movements reinforce as closely as possible the maneuvers of the character on screen, with the physics, animation, and sound effects further adding to the desired effect, and in this regard, having all of your yo-ing abilities tied to the right thumbstick makes a lot of sense, as on a technical level, it really gives you the feel of having delicate control over your yo-yo. Isolated from the rest of the game, this aspect is actually really well done. The problem, though, is that this complex control scheme adds absolutely nothing to the game, while the more standard controls end up being far more precise and far less sloppy when put into practice. In theory, you would want to have extra control over your yo-yo, hence the dual stick setup, but because this game also has an auto lock-on system, and one that works quite well at that, there's no reason at all to ever manually aim your yo-yo, and even if there were, simply turning Penny to face the direction you want to throw the yo-yo in is far more precise and intuitive anyway, so while I understand the idea behind the dual stick setup from a game feel perspective, ultimately this strikes me as an attempt to innovate for innovation's sake rather than as a creative solution to an expected problem. Not to mention having to constantly flick the stick to both attack and dash through the air is more than a little tiring to the thumb, as it's not an action that's common to either video games or in everyday life, but the bigger issue is what was sacrificed to bring this unique control scheme to life. One of the things that took some getting used to was the fact that you have basically no control over the camera in this game whatsoever, which to be fair isn't that big of a deal based on what kind of game this is, but I get the sense that the auto camera came about after the decision to have a dual stick control setup, and then the game was designed around not having camera controls rather than it being decided early on to have an auto camera and then realizing that you could use the right thumbstick for something else now. Maybe I'm wrong on that, seeing as this game's taking most of its inspiration from the Sonic Adventure games, which don't give you much camera control, but it really feels as though the bulk of this game's core design was brought about to make way for an unnecessary dual stick setup. And I know it's unnecessary because I played through the first half of the game forcing myself to use this control scheme because I wanted to see if this were just a case of the game doing something so wildly new and innovative that it had a bit of a learning curve to it and felt wrong at first. I wanted to give the game and the developers the benefit of the doubt. And while I did eventually get quite good at using this dual stick setup, the game never really rewarded me for taking the time to learn this awkward control scheme. Never was there a moment where something was easier to do once I had mastered the pro controls. Never was there a segment of a level that could only be reached by using my sick manually controlled yo-yo skills. Never was there a moment where the game even hinted that the pro control method was anything more than a harebrained idea someone on the team had that seemed new and innovative, but is ultimately just a far worse setup for 3D platforming controls than the standard, which by this point in video game history is so well refined and optimized that there's really not much room left for improvement. So for the second half of the game, I went back to the standard controls where on my controller, jump is X, attack is square, and lo and behold, nothing about the game changed in the slightest. If anything, it got a little better as I was now able to call upon 25 years of muscle memory. Yeah, so it got a little better, perhaps, but still not great, because even using a more standard control scheme, this game still kinda controls like crap. And this, once again, I feel is due to the developers' insistence on the pro controls for this game, as it feels as though they were so focused on making that work that they ended up half-assing the standard controls and bungling both of them in the process. The biggest problem is that there are just too many actions tied to too few buttons. Part of Penny's core moveset involves your typical double jump, which is fine, I guess, but pitifully short. Actually, her standard jump height is very shallow in comparison to most 3D platformers, and especially in comparison to the Sonic Adventure games. Furthermore, Penny just moves so slow when not riding her yo-yo to the point that anytime you have to walk, it feels as though you're moving through mud, and I found myself constantly bunny hopping in segments where I couldn't ride ride my yo-yo since your horizontal movement speed is slightly faster in the air than while on the ground. In theory, this would be fine, as having a 3D platforming character with a pitiful jump and slow movement can actually be a good way to incentivize a player to utilize the character's other abilities. For example, this is something that Froggun made excellent use of a couple of years ago, with Renata's shallow jump height and slow walking speed being made up for by the versatility of the titular Froggun mechanic, which, come to think of it, is strikingly similar to Penny's yo-yo ability, although executed much better. However, Froggun's developer Mulgado also had the good sense to simply put a twist on standard 3D platforming controls rather than trying to reinvent the wheel with some pointless dual stick nonsense, while still having a high level of nuance and precision in its controls, and lo and behold, aiming by turning was all it took to make the controls nice and tight and allow you to pull off some crazy speedrunning maneuvers that poor Penny here could only dream of. However, the bigger problem with Penny's Big Breakaway is how many different maneuvers are tied to the attack button/stick itself. Since Penny can't jump for shit, a lot of your mid-air control is covered by different yo-yo maneuvers, such as tapping the attack button/stick while in the air to gain some hang time, holding the attack button/stick to swing in mid-air from your yo-yo, or double tapping the attack button/stick to perform a mid-air dash. All this is fine in theory and is actually a lot more interesting than simply running, jumping, and double jumping, but because it's all based on timing and the fact that each maneuver gives you a different amount of horizontal movement, as well as the fact that you can only do each of these maneuvers once before hitting the ground, I often found myself fumbling over which maneuver to use in order to gain the right amount of horizontal movement and avoid over or undershooting the platform I wanted to land on. This, combined with the auto camera system, which is more than a little finicky and makes it difficult to gauge how close or far away something actually is, meant that I would miss jumps constantly, and from what I've seen on various discussion forums about this game, I'm far from the only one. Personally, I would have put Penny's swing ability as well as her mid-air dash ability on separate buttons because, as is, it's far too easy to accidentally hold the button down just a little bit too long and swing when you want to do just a quick yo throw or fall to your death because you didn't double tap the button fast enough and the mid-air dash didn't activate. I also would have made it so that your ability to ride your yo-yo was tied to you having to hold the trigger button to ride it rather than it being a toggle, because as it stands, if you want to dismount your yo-yo, you have to hit the ride button again or jump off of it, which, like the stupid penguin guards, creates just the slightest hiccup in your flow and momentum. Being able to just let go of the button and have Penny go right back to being on her feet would have gone a long way toward tightening up this aspect of her movement. Or better yet, just allow the player to adjust the controls to their own liking rather than just giving them a choice between standard 3D platforming controls that are afraid to use too many buttons or a pointless pro mode that needlessly complicates things. Not being able to adjust controls is kind of inexcusable in this day and age, if you ask me. The last thing I have to say about the controls, because I know I've been on this jag for a while, is that they are just some of the most temperamental I've seen in a while, with the game just not recognizing button inputs as precisely as it should. I can't remember the last time I played a game where so many of my jumps didn't register when I pressed the button, or the controls just glitched out and stopped working entirely for half a second, or how pressing left or right on the thumbstick oftentimes isn't enough to actually steer Penny's yo-yo when riding it, so you end up missing a turn or running into a wall, but then if you hold forward and then tilt the thumbstick slightly left or right, suddenly you can turn really sharply, and the dead zone between these two extremes is practically non-existent, so you end up fumbling about constantly while steering just to maintain your course. Overall, the controls are a mess. Not bad, I don't want to give that impression, as they do get the job done, and with just a little bit more tinkering on the part of the developers, they could be a lot better, but they feel woefully unfinished, and worst of all, they don't really feel like they fit with the rest of the game and don't mesh very well with the excellent level design, to the point that Penny almost feels like a character from a different game that someone modded into this game without adjusting her moveset or character weight to match. This leads to a strange disconnect between the player and the game, where you never really get comfortable and never really hit that special moment of gameplay where the controller just seems to disappear from your hands and your button inputs flow naturally without you having to think about them. While playing, I very much get the sense that whoever worked on Penny's controls and whoever worked on the level design didn't have a lot of communication between the two of them, and that Penny's character weight, moveset, and control scheme was developed in an isolated test environment with very little refining of either her or the level design to complement one another. And actually, I'd wager that this was the case, as many of the bonus levels which you unlock by collecting nuts hidden throughout the main levels showcase just what this game could have been if it had been a more traditional 3D platformer. These extra levels, called Star Globes, are short and sweet little challenges that take one or two mechanics from the main game and develop them into their own mini levels. Most of these challenges forego the momentum-based 3D platforming approach that the main game is striving for, and instead deliver an experience that's less Sonic Adventure and more 3D Mario, and you know what? They're excellent. Seriously, these bonus levels are by far the best part of the game, as the level design of practically all of them meshes perfectly with Penny's control scheme, to the point that it's almost as if a more standard 3D platformer was originally what was intended by the developers, but because they're all a bunch of Sonic fans, they felt obligated to make something momentum-based instead. And that's really a shame, because these levels are so much fun and challenging, and it sucks that they're all hidden behind an unlock system that requires you to hunt and find trinkets throughout each level. Trinkets that are hidden to the point that you have to slow down and carefully look for them, which is completely antithetical to the idea of maintaining momentum and flow that's at the heart of the game. And come to think of it, another aspect that's completely antithetical to the heart of the game are the side quests this game shoehorns into each level by having 3 rando NPCs that you need to complete a task of some sort for. These tasks usually range from collecting a certain number of objects, delivering an item to another character later in the level, destroying some obstacle, etc. The problem with these is a similar one to finding nuts hidden throughout the level, in that they force you to stop, figure out what the NPC wants, and then occasionally deviate from the route you intended to take in order to complete these tasks. Worse yet, some of these tasks are on a timer which starts ticking down the moment you interact with the NPC, with you having to quickly read the text blurb to figure out what you're supposed to do, but because the timer is already super tight, you're almost always guaranteed to fail these time challenges your first time around, because the amount of time it takes to read what needs to be done is just enough time to ensure that the clock will run out before you complete your task. Really, the only reason you'd want to do these tasks for these NPCs anyway is because it increases your score multiplier at the end of the level, but since going fast and reaching the goal as quickly as possible is also factored into your score, these two aspects are, once again, completely opposed to one another, and I'm sure this is something that could be quite annoying for the 3 people left in the world who care about getting a high score. I'm not one of those people, so I just ignore these side tasks entirely, as they're really half-assed and kinda tedious to complete anyway. Actually, NPCs are a bit of a problem in general, as there are just a ton of them littered throughout each level, to the point that they end up getting in your way and slowing you down a lot of the time. I don't know who thought it was a good idea to place them on yo-yo tracks and ramps in positions that ensure that you'll almost always run into them and come to a screeching halt unless you know ahead of time that they're there, but whoever it was doesn't deserve a Christmas bonus this year. Tiny Tim can fucking starve for all I care. Then there are the bosses, and they suck, ranging from either far too easy and predictable like Emperor Eddie the Sumo and Eyeball Boy here, to frustrating as hell like this giant penguin robo that you have to battle on conveyor belts, or this metal Sonic ripoff race that probably would be the best boss in the game if it weren't for the aforementioned core issue of the controls not matching the level design. Ugh. And this game is just so frustrating to someone like me, as when I first watched this trailer, I thought it was going to be something right up my alley. 3D platformers are one of my favorite genres, and I've always said that we need more momentum-based ones like the Sonic Adventure games, as I feel that there's still a lot left to be explored with this style and set of mechanics, but execution is what matters, and in that regard, Penny's Big Breakaway is a big disappointment. So is there anything that I liked about the game? Well, yeah, like I said, I really like Penny's character design. I really like the idea behind the cosmic yo-yo, and I really like the bonus levels, which, while foregoing the momentum-based design methodology, really come into their own and deliver a tight and enjoyable 3D platforming experience. I just wish that they were expanded upon and that this was the core of the game. Graphically, this game is gorgeous as well, despite a few characters feeling a little out of place in this world. The game has a very strong look to it overall that's quite reminiscent of the classic Sonic games. You can really tell that the people who made this are all Sonic superfans, as they managed to recapture the spirit, style, and visual tone of the Sonic series while also putting their own twist on things as well. This is especially seen in the music, which is definitely the game's best feature. The soundtrack for this game is incredible, and is by far my favorite OST of the year so far, so while the gameplay didn't really do it for me, the presentation and its bells and whistles absolutely did. As I said earlier, I judge games through the lens of art criticism and hold them to a high standard as works of art, not as mere entertainment. I don't stack up the good and stack up the bad and come to my conclusion based on whether or not one outweighs the other. I take it all as a whole and try to come up with what the essence of the game ultimately is. And when viewed through that lens, Penny's Big Breakaway just isn't all that impactful, but even worse, it lacks that crucial aspect that separates all meaningful works of art from the mediocre dreck. It just doesn't have heart. We talked a little bit about heart last time in my critique of The Inquisitor, and in that video I said something along the lines of heart being a sense that someone really cared about the project that they were working on and gave it their all to bring it to life despite the circumstances it was created in. And while I still stand by that assessment, I'd like to add an addendum, because what I think I'm really getting at with this whole heart idea is not that a game or any work of art has to give the audience a sense of someone's passion, but more a sense that the creator was working from the heart rather than from the head. Let me explain. This might not make a lot of sense for the non-creative individuals in the crowd, but for those of you who dabble in the arts, regardless of the medium, it's probably something that's going to ring true, because you've probably had this experience firsthand, even if you've never been able to explain it. For my fellow creatives out there, you know that when you're working on something, the process either goes one of two ways. Either you have a vision and you kick and scream and fight like hell to bring that vision to life as close as you can possibly get it to how it looks or feels in your head, only for the final product to end up being a massive disappointment. Or you have a vision and you start working on it, but as you do, you start making compromises and generating new ideas based on those compromises, and more compromises based on those new ideas. You recognize that the project is changing drastically from what you originally had in mind, yet the work just seems to flow effortlessly from you, almost as if you were possessed by a greater power that's merely using you as their instrument to create something unique and beautiful. When the project's finally completed, it's nothing like what you first envisioned, but something far different, something far greater, and something that you can't believe was made by your own two hands. And even if it ended up flawed and mangled in some way, you can't help but admire the artistry of what you've created. You didn't fight it and allowed it to become what it was always destined to be, and because of that, any flaws that it has only adds to its charm and meaning. That's what I'm talking about when I say that something has heart, that was the state that the work of art was created in, and I believe that that's what separates good art from bad art, the intuitive sense that something was created spontaneously and irrationally and with an inexplicable magic, rather than being cold and calculated and thoroughly thought out and carefully constructed to hit all the perfect beats to give the illusion of quality and polish, but never once touching someone on a deeper level of artistic wonder. And I just don't get that sense with Penny's Big Breakaway. I get the sense that Evening Star were too afraid to let the project be what it wanted to be and had to fight it from start to finish so that the final result came as close as it could to the momentum-based 3D platformer they envisioned when they first began. I get the sense that Penny's Big Breakaway, the project itself, wanted to be something else. It wanted to be a more traditional 3D platformer along the lines of what is found in the Starglobe stages, yet the developers were too stubborn to change their vision. It has to be a momentum-based 3D platformer because that's what we set out to make. It has to be level-based with a linear progression and branching paths because we're the studio who got our start based on our love of Sonic the Hedgehog, and that's what we want to see more of. It has to be an extension of the goodwill of the community we fostered while making Sonic Mania, because if it isn't, we might be forgotten and our time as game developers may come to an end. This game just radiates trepidation to make something meaningful for fear of rejection, which ironically has caused Evening Star to craft the very thing they were so desperately trying to avoid. This, I think, is the frustration that I and many others feel when we play this game. It's not just our frustration of how off-putting a lot of the gameplay can be at times, but the frustration of the game itself for not being able to be itself, for not ending up as a type of game and experience it so desperately wanted to be, and a disappointment with its developers for not letting it grow and evolve as it saw fit, mixed with the bitterness of the developers themselves towards a project that fell far short of what they stubbornly wanted to create. As far as entertainment goes, Penny's Big Breakaway isn't a bad game. There are certainly enough redeeming qualities that I think it's worth a playthrough for most fans of 3D platformers, and especially fans of momentum-based 3D platformers, since there are so few of those around, and there are certainly hints of something greater that shine through occasionally, like in the Starglobes, that can make you wonder just what the game could have been, which make it an interesting experience to someone like me who derives a lot of enjoyment from psychoanalyzing the artistic process. But as far as art is concerned, Penny's Big Breakaway is a massive failure. The game doesn't have heart, it's cold, it's calculated, and has been beaten into submission and forced into a shape that it was never meant to be, rather than nurtured and allowed to change and grow as it deserved. Which is a shame, because there's clearly a lot of talent at Evening Star and so much potential for true artistry and an ability to make meaningful and impactful experiences, and I hope they give us that one day, because I really think they have what it takes to do just that. So if all you're looking for is something fun to play, you might find some enjoyment here, because on a technical level, there's nothing too egregious about the game other than a few rough patches, but if you're looking for good art that comes close to the heart, like I am, look elsewhere, because by those standards, this might just be the worst game I've played all year. I'm Noa Lee, god of game criticism, and thus have I spoken.